Welcome back to the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. For those newly joining the program, my name is Irina Zuckerman, and I am the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. Today with us, we have Alberto Fernandez, not the outgoing president of Argentina. And to be honest, I would very much prefer to interview his successor. But the ambassador, retired diplomat, and currently the vice president of Memory, an organization that is focused on translating important key events from various languages, including and especially Arabic, but also Russian and various others, so that American and Western audiences could see what's going on in other parts of the world for themselves. Alberto Fernandez has had a very long and distinguished career in many countries around the world. He'll tell you a little bit about that himself, including Sudan, which is going to be the topic of today's discussion. And he continues to be involved in various international efforts, including the Madrid Forum. To this day, he's also been the head of the Middle East Broadcast Network under the Trump administration, which includes Al-Hura, an outreach effort to the Middle East, especially Iraq, and we'll mention all of that before delving into today's discussion. Thank you so much for joining us today. You've had a very, very fascinating career, and you continue to make enormous impacts today. Could you tell us a little bit about how you got into diplomacy and some of your experiences, especially leading up to the Sudan posting?
Wow, thank you, Irina. It's a pleasure to be on with you. That's a big question. I don't want to spend a huge amount of time talking about myself. I was a career foreign service officer for 32 years. And I was always interested in the Middle East as a teenager growing up in Miami. I'm from South Florida. So I learned Arabic. I learned Arabic in the U.S. military, then studied Arabic in college, then joined the Foreign Service and, had a long career, mostly in the Middle East, but I also served in Africa and in Latin America. So basically, that's it.
Excellent. So now that we're seeing another war breaking out, and not the one that everyone's attention is on, not Israel and Hamas, but rather Sudan. There's a bunch of conflicts all rolled into one. We have the government forces versus the RSF. We are seeing a conflict with South Sudan breaking out over disputed territory. All of this is probably a bit of a mystery to most people. A decade or so ago, maybe more, we've heard all this demonstration about Save Darfur, which have disappeared into nothing. Nobody even knows what that was about anymore. We've had some level of consciousness about that area of the world when al-Bashir was finally ousted from power. But since then, before and since, all of that appears to be kind of very murky waters for most of the audiences, even those closely following foreign events. Could you tell us a little bit about that general area? Who are the parties in conflict and why?
Yeah, well, obviously what happens is there are all kinds of conflicts in the world which don't get a lot of attention. In the last few years, we had the first global attention was monopolized mostly by the Ukraine war, the Russia-Ukraine war. And now even that one has been kind of superseded in terms of public attention by the Gaza war, the Hamas attack on Israel. Sudan is an important country in the sense that it's a very large country in Africa. It was, before the creation of South Sudan, the largest country in Africa. Imagine, it's the size of the United States east of the Mississippi. That's how big Sudan was. And even with subtracting South Sudan, it's still one of the largest countries in the world in terms of size. But it has a population only of about 45 million people. So there's a lot of empty space in Sudan. Sudan has had a long history. It is, on the Nile. So it's a history that goes back to the time of the pharaohs. In fact, there were black pharaohs that ruled Egypt from what is now Sudan. But the issue at hand now basically comes out of, you mentioned Bashir, is in 1989 there was a coup in Sudan that brought an Islamist government to power. And it's a government that lasted almost 30 years until 2019 when the Bashir regime was overthrown. There were, mass demonstrations by the people into the streets, against the regime, kind of pro-democracy demonstrators. But at the end of the day, what happened is Bashir's generals turned against him and they threw him out. And from 2019 to this year, 2023, you had basically a democracy movement, a kind of civilian democracy movement, and you had not one, but two armies in Sudan. Sudan had actually no government, but had two armies. Why did it have two armies? Because the Bashir regime, Bashir was an army general who came to power in a coup, and he was afraid that what he did, others would do to him. So he created he actually created more than one militias and units to use in special operations, in kind of dirty work, kind of like in Russia, you have the Russian army and you had Wagner. Wagner is a company. It's the same idea. You have the official army, and then you have another organization which you use for kind of gray areas, dirty work, bloody work. You don't want to waste your soldiers. You want to use these guys. And so that's what Bashir did. He used the Janjaweed, who are traditional Arab raiders from the Darfur area, and he formalized them as a military unit. And this became what's known as the RSF, the Rapid Support Forces. And this became an army in addition to the regular army. So it grew and grew and grew until it was basically the same size as the regular military. And the regular military has ruled Sudan for most of its history. So basically what you had starting in April of this year was an explosion where these two partners who had overthrown Bashir, who wanted to, who have their business empires, who have their commercial interests, who are corrupt, they started fighting against each other. So you have the RSF on the one hand fighting SAF, SAF, the Sudan Armed Forces on the other hand. And so that's what's happened from April until now. A very bloody war. Over 10 million people have been displaced in Sudan. Malnutrition, poverty, ethnic cleansing, human rights abuses on both sides. That's what's happened so far.
So let's go back to the moment of Bashir's ousting. Everyone was celebrating it as a triumph of liberalism, democracy, and all good things over Islamism and dictatorship. To what extent was that ever actually true, given that it was the generals who overthrew him rather than the popular movements or grassroots movements pro-democracy that kind of fueled this opposition?
Well, that's a very good question. It's complicated. Look, there was, and there still is a grassroots movement for democracy in Sudan. And the wars kind of changed everything, but it was very broad. It was had very strong grassroots. They had local committees, people demonstrating, people blocking the streets, people taking on the military for years. But when you look at 2019, basically what often happens in these dictatorships is Bashir raised the price of bread. Bread became hard to get. People began rioting and demonstrating because they were hungry and because they opposed the dictatorship. So that began in late 2018. People demonstrated for months. They were killed in the streets for months, and they continued to do so. So what happened is late 2018, this starts December 2018, January, February, March. Bashir, at some point, he's tired of these demonstrations, right? They're blocking the streets, they're making life impossible. And he wants the RSF, which is kind of like his fire brigade, right? Or his, his special unit to go and clean the streets, to clear the demonstrators. That's when the leader of the RSF and the military, they basically decide, we're not going to kill thousands of people in the street. We're not going to kill thousands of civilians in the street because we don't want to do that. Better to get rid of you. But then you're right. So the people fought for months. They fought and they bled for months. But it took the military to finally remove Bashir. And here we have a bigger problem, which is the military, especially the army, was Bashir's army and was filled with Islamists. So you had an Islamist army overthrowing an Islamist government. But the army was not purged of its Islamists. So that became a problem. And then what you had, after, beginning in 2019, you had the development of an interim government, an interim civilian government with the military in key positions, which was then overthrown by the military in 2021, October 25th, 2021.
So let's look at those events, because for a while the West appeared to be at least somewhat invested into the civilian transition. Everyone thought that it would be better for the country. Nobody really, except for the Islamist states, nobody really wanted Islamists in power. How did it go so wrong? How did this Islamist coup against the transition, pro-secularism transition figures, how did it succeed?
Well, I mean, first it must be said that Sudan has always been an issue which has had international attention. There are all kinds of wars that happen nobody really cares about, but actually people cared about Sudan for different reasons throughout its history.
Mm-hmm.
There was a time when Sudan, the Khartoum government, was seen as a bulwark of the West against the communists. Mm-hmm. Why communists? Because the Southerners, the non-Muslim Southerners of what's now South Sudan, were helped by leftist regimes, by Mengistu's Ethiopia, by Cuba, those kinds of, national liberation movement type things. So in the 80s, the big supplier of weapons to Sudanese government was the U.S. government. So there's always been interest in Sudan. And then as the Sudanese regime became Islamist and hosted Osama bin Laden in the 90s, the interest became about this bad regime. And in the West also, there was a strong movement about concern about the Christians of South Sudan being killed by the Muslims, these jihadists so what had been a kind of Cold War thing, pro-Washington Khartoum against leftist rebels, became Islamist regime in Khartoum against Christian rebels, right? Mm-hmm. So that continued to, so the West has always been heavily invested in trying to solve Sudan. And the peace treaty, which led to ending the longest civil war in African history, which was the North-South War, the war between Khartoum and the Southerners, was brokered by the George W. Bush administration. So the Americans, the West, the Europeans have been involved for a very long time. So Bashir is overthrown in 2019. There's tremendous goodwill from the international community, but there's a problem, and that is the generals, right? How do you treat them? And basically what happens with the international community, I think they get bogged down in process This is a problem with diplomats. This is a problem with bureaucracies. They get very, very focused on process rather than on the result.
Mm-hmm.
So it becomes very drawn out and complicated. So the question became, when does Sudan go to elections? The fear was that if the elections were held early, you would probably get the same old crooked politicians that have always been there back in power.
Mm-hmm.
And so the idea was to give time for the development of kind of a deeper democratic culture, to do the reform first, reform society, help Sudan economically, remove Sudan from the terrorism list, help Sudan with its very large debt situation. All of these things were done. But the problem is that by doing this, the military became empowered. And the military, you had this basically conflict, these two military, RSF, SAF, in conflict with each other and in conflict with the civilians that they were sharing power with. There was a civilian prime minister, Dr. Abdullah Hamdok. And eventually, the generals decided that this civilian guy, we didn't want him looking into our business. The military has its economic empires that they did not want to surrender. They get wealthy from it. And so they overthrew him in 2021. And since 2021, Sudan basically had no government. As I said, two armies and no government. You can imagine. And what happened is, it was what was a triangular conflict: SAF, RSF, the civilians. When you remove the civilians from the picture, it became a conflict between the two militaries, a struggle for dominance between them. Who's going to be the boss, right? And there are cultural dimensions too. The regular Sudanese army is the leadership of the regular Sudanese army comes from a specific part of the country, whereas the RSF, the former Janjaweed, are men of the West. They're, rough, untutored, bandits, ex-bandits, ex-robbers, ex-gunmen for hire, not well educated. The generals in the army are the rulers of Sudan who have always ruled it, who look down their nose on those people from the West. Those are our servants. Those are our cannon fodder. And now they're having a problem that this is 2019, 2020, 2021. The RSF has money and actually paid more than the army. So this tension between the army and the RSF got worse and worse. And then April 15th, 2023, it burst into outright war, which is what we have to this day.
And they also have competing tribal and territorial loyalties, don't they?
Yes.
Who is in charge of what region of Sudan, and how does that impact this picture?
Well, yes, the RSF, led by a man named Mohammed Hamdan Daglo, who's known by his nickname Hemeti. The RSF has a very narrow base. Its narrow base is the Arab tribes of Darfur, basically. Specifically, certain types of Arab tribes, the camel herding, Rizigat tribes, Rizigat Confederation tribes of Darfur, which is a very small group of tribes. That's the leadership of the RSF. And the RSF is strong in the west of Sudan, Darfur, Kordofan. That's their base. The Khartoum regime, the army, the leadership comes from the Nile Valley, and they tend to be more urban, more educated, more upper class. So there's a tribal difference. There's also a kind of class difference, you could say. The Janjaweed or the RSF are those, are basically country people, uneducated people, whereas the army are the rulers. So the anger of one against the other is part of it's tribal, and part of it is also related to class, to questions of power, of history. In Sudan, the history was the army was led by these people from the Nile Valley, but the foot soldiers were from the west, Darfur, from Kordofan. So what you had is the former foot soldiers becoming generals themselves. Hemeti, the leader of the RSF, is a guy with a elementary school education. So there's a tribal situation, a tribal dimension, and the class dimension. And meanwhile, of course, there's a long history of Sudan of tribal violence, generated mostly by Khartoum. Khartoum basically using policies of divide and conquer. We have an enemy. Let's find who the enemy of that enemy is and arm them. This is what happened in Darfur 20 years ago. The uprising of 20 years ago, what led to Save Darfur, were rebel movements based in certain African tribes, non-Arab African tribes, that shocked the government, shocked Khartoum. This is at the very time that Khartoum was making peace with Southerners. And so what did Khartoum do? They armed and supported the hereditary enemies of these African tribes, who were the Arab tribes, the camel herding Arab tribes. That's the origin of the Janjaweed. So Khartoum created this mess. They created a Praetorian Guard that turned against them, And the other interesting thing about the RSF, which, as I said, is based in Darfur, based in the West, is that as the war began, they were able to seize much of the capital. And they still control much of Khartoum, a city of 9 million people, or a city that used to have 9 million people, maybe has 3 million or 4 million, who knows? But they were able to, hold on to this day to most of the capital. And generally, the RSF have been able to outfight the army to this day.
So we are seeing this crazy scenario. We have this military in Khartoum with the remnants of Bashir-era Islamists that nobody wanted to begin with. The civilians are nowhere to be found. They're nowhere the rule anyway. And then
they're running for their lives. The civilians are running for their lives or starving. Yes.
So seeing this mess that absolutely is in nobody's interest, anywhere in the world, why hasn't there been some leverage to kind of create some power sharing scenario that would bring the pro-civilian transitioners back and then kind of create some sort of a arrangement without the generals, but with the interests of all these different conflicting tribes, which would seem to be a common sense solution, a difficult one, but more or less at least some sort of a framework?
Well, because the generals have no interest in doing that. Both sides want it all. They want to win. And both sides now see the other as illegitimate. And there's so much blood now, right? That has flowed. So that's the problem. And of course, both sides have foreign allies and foreign patrons, which also adds to the mix. So what you're saying makes sense, but it requires somebody to force the generals. And, one of the challenges of the United States and of the West is that the West is just not engaged as much as it was before. The U.S., when the generals overthrew the civilian government in October 25th, 2021, the West did nothing, essentially nothing. Why? Well, there was a genocidal war happening next door in Ethiopia, right? That was more important. Later, There was a war in Ukraine. That was more important. So the West hasn't wanted to expend its political capital on this issue, knowing that it's not that easy. Who's going to force these generals in this country, which is already a mess? Not easy to force them to the negotiating table when they both feel that they each one controls about half the country. Each one is battered but not defeated. Each one thinks that maybe they can put together more men, more weapons, a political strategy, and overwhelm the other. That's the hope. So that's a problem. It's a problem from hell, as somebody once said. I think it was Samantha Power, who's a notorious figure. But this is a problem from hell because it's a terrible, terrible problem. The West cares, but the West doesn't care that much.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't care that much to actually what? What are they going to do? Invade Sudan, a huge country? Who's going to fight for Sudan? In the West, in the East, the Arabs, the Americans? No. So this is a problem. So it goes on and on and on and on.
So let's look at those who do have a stake in this conflict and who are, in fact, the foreign patrons of these two factions. On the one hand, with RSF, we have somewhat surprisingly, or maybe not, Saudi Arabia and Egypt. Egypt, on the one hand, it likes the stability of a military regime. On the other hand, these guys are Islamists, and Egypt has been very anti-Islamist.
You mean the army on the side of Saad?
Yes, exactly.
Yes,
the Khartoum, and Saudi Arabia has also proclaimed to be anti-Islamist. On the other hand, RSF, which is, strictly speaking, warlords, they're not necessarily religious, but they are bloody, have a very strange mix of Wagner. They have the Emiratis who also claim to be anti-Islamist, and you have Libya's Haftar, who is backed in turn by Egypt against pro-Islamist factions in Tripoli. This is a very bizarre framework where allies on various questions are literally facing each other off. What's behind this interest? Why have they chosen these sides?
How long is this program? No, it is because each one has a complicated motivation. Every single one of these players that you mentioned, it's not a simple motivation. It's complicated. For example, take Egypt. Egypt is anti-Islamist. But Egypt knows that there are Islamists in the army.
Mm-hmm.
But they also know that there are non-Islamists in the army. Egypt doesn't like the RSF because it believes that the RSF are close to Ethiopia. Seems odd, doesn't it? And Egypt has this issue of the Nile River waters. Also, Egypt sees that the RSF are, as you said, warlords and chaotic, and Egypt prefers a military like a government like its own government, which is a military dictatorship. So what Egypt would want to see is not an Islamist general ruling Sudan, but a nationalist general ruling Sudan. Instead of Abdel Fattah Sisi in Egypt, you have Abdel Fattah al-Burhan. They have the same first name, al-Burhan, in Sudan. He's their guy. He's the guy they back, even though they know that there are many Islamists in the army, and the Islamists have really gained strength from the army side. So it's a complicated situation. The UAE supports the RSF. You mentioned Wagner, but why Wagner? Remember, the RSF fought in Libya.
Mm-hmm.
Wagner was in Libya. Both of them supporting Haftar. They're supporting Haftar. Why? Because Egypt wanted it and the UAE wanted it. So both of them were, they're working together, And by the way, the Khartoum has nothing against Wagner. It just happens that that's just how it wound up. It's not like they're opposed to them. The people just kind of some of these people just wound up on one side for a variety of reasons. So it's a crazy, crazy war. It's, it's a war that the world ignores, but it's drawn in a huge number. And of course, all of these countries are providing, and organizations that you mentioned are providing expertise, weapons, money, all kinds of stuff. It's an incredibly complicated issue.
Would it be fair to say that by backing these sides with arms and money and whatever, they're actually fueling the continuity of conflict and preventing from these sides from giving up and forcing themselves into some sort of an arrangement?
Yes, certainly. Look, Sudan has a domestic arms industry. Sudan is awash in weapons. Sudan has local sources of some wealth. So if none of these countries were actively involved, the conflict would continue, but it would peter out more rapidly, and either one side or another would win. It would come to an end more rapidly. So the fact that both sides are getting, you could say, reinforcements from, through their allies prolongs the conflict, makes the conflict even worse. Both sides have terrible human rights records. Both of them have murdered innocent people. The RSF are more bloody because of this. They come out of this tribal tradition in Darfur, so they have tribal enemies in Darfur who they've used the situation to kind of settle accounts with, and kind of target the Masalit and other tribes for extermination, basically, or at least expulsion from Sudan.
One of the semi-rumors, semi-backed statements that I have heard about this in the last few months is that the UAE managed to bring Chad, or at least mercenaries from Chad, on board into this conflict by exercising direct influence with the leadership in Chad. And prior to that, Chad has been involved in a number of other regional conflicts, but now they've become a new party to something that seemed to be on the verge of loss at RSF at one point. How accurate is that? And is it possible to pressure any of these sides to start bringing in additional players at least?
Well, I'm laughing because the idea of fighters coming from Chad into Sudan is decades old. This has been going on for decades. When I was in Sudan, 14 years ago, the locals in Darfur would complain to me about fighters coming in from Chad being given. They said these people don't even speak Arabic, them being given, or Chad or Niger or wherever, and they would be given Sudanese military ID cards and passports and naturalization certificates and stuff like that. So there's an old tradition of fighters coming in from Chad. And the RSF has had fighters, or the Janjaweed have had fighters from Chad for 20 years. So this is nothing new. What seems to have happened with the UAE is this, and this again is incredibly complicated. I apologize to your listeners because there's like too much detail, but Chad is kind of similar to Sudan in the sense that there are many contending tribal groups with complicated history between them. Chad is ruled by a small tribe in Chad, which also exists in Sudan. They're found on both sides. Zagawa. The Zagawas were enemies of the Janjaweed, of the Arab tribes. They fought with each other, except that sometimes they allied with each other. This is the confusion. So at the beginning of the war, I think this is what you're referring to. At the beginning of the war, Chad was hostile to the RSF because they didn't want the war to spread into Chad. There are also Arab tribes in Chad. There's Zagawa on both sides, there are Arab tribes on both sides, and the same Arab tribes. So they blocked the border, but the story goes, the Emiratis, realizing that the RSF needed a kind of rear guard, an area where they could receive equipment and supplies and reinforcements, caused the government of Debi's son, the current dictator in Chad, is the son of the former dictator in Chad, caused them to switch sides, that they somehow paid him to switch sides. But it's well known, this is a well-known fact, there is great controversy within the cupola, within the leadership of the regime in Chad, the generals who rule it, about which side they should be on. Some want to be, so some are pro-RSF and some are pro-SAF. Some are being paid by one side or paid by the other side, are afraid of one side or afraid of the other. So basically anything could happen. There could be a coup in Chad tomorrow. There could be a kind of switch in policy in Chad to help one side or another tomorrow or not. So it's impossible to tell. The war hasn't destabilized the entire region. The region is already unstable, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it has had destabilizing effects on two countries especially, and that is Chad and South Sudan.
So let's get to the South Sudan, because on top of this incredibly complicated situation to begin with, we are now seeing also a territorial dispute flare up, with the RSF being a key player in that particular area. What is that dispute about? US is trying to pressure South Sudan to withdraw its forces from the disputed area. Why are they siding with South Sudan over that issue? What is happening?
Well, the border between South Sudan and Sudan is disputed in many places. There's a couple of areas where the dispute goes back years. In the far, far west, this Kafia Kinji part, West Darfur, South Darfur, and bordering South Sudan, an area which is a wild area. There are no roads there. There are no, very few people, but there's rich grazing fields for cattle, and there's a possibility of gold and other stuff and then there's Abyei, this region on the border, which is populated by people from South Sudan and tribesmen from the north. And it's a conflicted area. It's an area whose status has never been clearly resolved. Meanwhile, the situation is even more complicated in this sense, and that is South Sudan depends overwhelmingly on oil. The oil that South Sudan pumps goes through Sudan. The oil pipelines go through Sudan and end in Port Sudan. Port Sudan is controlled by the army. But a large part of the area where the pipelines go through are controlled by RSF, which means South Sudan is neutral, because if it was to lean towards Khartoum, towards the army, the RSF could blow up those oil pipelines tomorrow. Mm-hmm. And South Sudan's 90%, 95% of South Sudan's budget comes from that oil. So South Sudan is at the mercy of the conflict. Obviously, also, if which is less likely, if South Sudan was to lean towards the RSF, Khartoum could close the army regime could close the pipeline in Port Sudan. So basically, the army controls the end of the pipeline, and the RSF controls the middle of the pipeline. And there's no other way for South Sudan to get its oil out. So that's why it's neutral so far.
But why is that issue flaring up now with essentially a civil war inside Sudan? Isn't RSF, and aren't the Sudanese factions afraid of getting distracted by fighting over the border issue with South Sudan at the time when their own differences are unresolved? Aren't they diluting their forces?
Not really. The border issue is an old one, and I mean, it's not seen as a kind of a nationalist thing.
Mhm.
Everyone knows that these are political decisions that are going to be made, that the border is going to be resolved one way or another at some point, that both sides cheat when they can. So for example, when there was civil war in South Sudan and peace in the north, the army, the Bashir regime in the north, the Bashir regime could take advantage of the south. They could cheat, they could move down a little bit, cross the borders, they could make trouble, they could do stuff like that. When the situation is reversed, it means that the Southerners can also decide to move up a little. They can decide to protect their fellow Dinka tribesmen in Abyei, for example, and provide them security and safety and stuff like that. So there's a lot of heat. There was a lot of heat before the war about the border between Sudan and Ethiopia,
Mhm.
because those are two different countries. But even though South Sudan is a different country, they were together for 50 years and they know each other very well. They're like intimate enemies, right? Or frenemies, if you want to say. So that's different. That's less of a hot conflict as it was when there were border clashes between Ethiopia and Sudan in 2020 or 2021.
I wonder what happened to those, given that Ethiopia is still not 100% stable, and of course Sudan has got these internal developments. Has this issue with the Ethiopia been actually politically resolved, or is it just a matter of everyone being busy with the other fights? So,
It's everyone being busy with their own things. Nothing has been resolved.
mhm.
The early, as I said, the early common wisdom was the idea that the RSF favored Ethiopia, or Ethiopia favored the RSF, because the army was seen as close to Egypt. But some say now that Ethiopia has moved away from the RSF because they consider them to be, unstable and kind of chaotic, chaos force, a force for chaos. But at the beginning of the war, the army saw Ethiopia and Kenya as being pro RSF. But you see, what happens is these guys keep switching sides depending on money, on immediate interests, on a whole range of factors.
So there are no stable alliances per se in all of this.
Not really. I mean, there's nothing which is a 100% stable. There are very close relationships, say the relationship of Egypt with SAF, or the relationship of UAE with RSF. Those are very close. But I think all of those relationships are very transactional.
Mhm.
They're very much subject to circumstance. It's not like they love these guys. It's purely self-interest and kind of seen through a kind of a very biased lens, whether from Cairo or in Jamina or Abu Dhabi or Riyadh or wherever.
Meanwhile, there are some factors that could make a huge difference in various other areas, which is Sudanese gold. One of the issues that Wagner is involved in, their interest is literally getting access to that gold, and we've seen how Wagner operates in other countries in Africa. So it's
Yeah.
not hard to imagine that the process is very similar here. What happens if any of the parties take control of those gold mines? What do you see that potential money flow? Where do you see it going, and how can it impact regional affairs?
Well, there has not been there have been problems. The two big. There are several things that Sudan exports. Sudan is the world's largest exporter of gum arabic, which is used in Coca-Cola and all kinds of other things. So thing that grows on trees, on acacia trees. Sudan's the #1 exporter in the world for that. And that's been disrupted a little bit. But the two big products are oil, which is not from Sudan, it's from South Sudan, and gold, which you mentioned. The oil problem, as I said, it's in the south, it goes through RSF territory and winds up in army territory. So the three actors there involved have not wanted to mess with that because they're all getting money from it. All three of them are getting money from it. The gold is overwhelmingly in RSF controlled territory. And the RSF is still able to get gold out. It's still able, there have been American sanctions on some of the companies, the RSF connected companies, just like Wagner and connected companies, to prevent the gold getting out. But let's face it, gold is very fungible, right? Like conflict diamonds. This is conflict gold. And so there has been as far as I can tell, there's been no disruption whatsoever in RSF control of the gold mines of Sudan. They still control them. They still get them out. They still use them for personal wealth and for funding their war operations.
Now, I remember a few months ago you wrote an article explaining some of the factors inherent to that war up to that point. And one of the issues that you predicted was that sooner or later SAF would actually gain control, being that they are at a distinct advantage, which they are. They have a bigger military, they're better trained, better educated, they have significant level of support from major states. But nevertheless, in recent weeks,
it hasn't happened. That's right.
It not only hasn't happened, but RSF appears to be gaining ground. It took over airports today, took over a base in one of the days. It killed over 800 people in Darfur. How did this come to pass? How did they manage?
Well, there's several things. Number one, and this is a basic fact, the RSF fight better than the army. They are better fighters. They are more experienced fighters. They fought in Libya and they fought in Yemen a lot. Now, the army was in Yemen, but the army was not on the front lines. The RSF was on the front lines. So they have a lot more combat experience than the army. The army was the army of fat generals in Khartoum. And you may, I don't know if this happens in Eastern Europe, it happens a lot in Africa, of ghost soldiers. You're a general and you have a unit of 10,000 soldiers, but they're actually really only 5,000 of them. And you're taking the salaries of the other 5,000 and putting them in your pocket. This is SAF. This is exactly what the army was doing. So the army has helicopter gunships, it has jet fighters, it has or had tanks. The RSF had none of those things. But man for man, the RSF fight better than the army. They're natural fighters, or I should say, they're natural raiders or bandits, right? They're good at hit and run operations. They're good at robbing you and leaving, or raping you and leaving, which are very bad things. But guess what? They're also good at attacking a military target and evading the adversary and taking it. So they're much more mobile than the army. And the army doesn't have enough soldiers, so it has to draw soldiers from the civilian population of people who are, young men who don't have any combat experience, whereas the RSF are much more battle hardened. What I tried to say in that article is, if the army could get its act together, and I went step by step how they would do it. Like, you could read it and say, do this. But they haven't been able to do so. They haven't been able, they're still on the defensive, and the RSF is slowly advancing. On the battlefield, it's mostly RSF advances. Slow, sometimes difficult, sometimes easy, but it's like the RSF is practicing a kind of salami tactic. You know, a salami, you cut a little slice at a time. So they're taking a little slice out of SAF-controlled territory, a little bit at a time. If that logic is uninterrupted, then RSF will win. Now, the army has all these advantages. You know, it has this heavy equipment that the RSF doesn't have. It has a close relationship with Egypt. Egypt doesn't have money, but Egypt has weapons. It has a close relationship with Turkey, who also has weapons. And, you know, there was talk of these Bayraktar drones being sent to the battlefield. They haven't appeared yet. But Turkey has promised to help the army. So, you know, Burhan, the head of the army, went to the United Nations. He met Zelensky. He went to Egypt. He went to Turkey. You know, he did the grand tour of seeing all these people. So he has a certain level of pseudo legitimacy, but he really hasn't been able to transfer it to the most important thing, which is performance on the battlefield.
So tries Qatar and Turkey and all these other countries, in terms of backing Burhan, he's really not able to do much with whatever he's providing. Although I have heard rumors that Ukrainian fighters have been out and around knocking off Wagner forces specifically. I'm not sure how much of an impact that has had, to be honest, but
it's, you know, to be frank, the whole issue is exaggerated. You know, Khartoum, the army played this up, and others have tried to play it up. The Wagner element, it's a very marginal element for Sudan. That Wagner helps them, of course. There's no doubt about that. But you know, you notice who goes to Russia too is the vice president of the army regime, Malik Agar, went to Russia for the African summit, and there's a picture of him there with Putin. And you know, they have friendly relationships with Russia. So I see it as more. It's both sides are pro-Russia. One side is pro-Wagner, and not just pro-Russia. That's the difference between them. You could almost say that the civil conflict that occurs in the cupola of the regime in Moscow is mirrored on the ground in Sudan. As for the Ukrainians, there are all these rumors. The RSF says that they're there. I don't know why they would be there. It makes no sense to me. You know, it's a sideshow. It's not significant one way or another. If RSF wins tomorrow, it's a disaster for Sudan. It has no effect on the war in Ukraine or Russia. Not really. Especially the gold is still going out and all of that is still happening. You know, now if SAF wins, okay, a friend of Wagner will have lost, but there's not much gain there. It's marginal. Again, I don't think it's a big thing.
Meanwhile, there has been, you know, and I watched it with the whole thing transpire with morbid, sort of a morbid amusement, in a very, very dark gallows way. There was this peace summit in Saudi Arabia focused on bringing the sides together, and while the peace summit was going on, RSF captured an airport. So my question is, what was the goal of what were they hoping to achieve? Why did they, you know, especially with one of the sides not really being present, and where is the diplomatic direction going now after it failed so spectacularly?
Well, it's nothing new. Both sides are still committed to military victory. Or victory. I mean, if SAF could get it without fighting, they would love that. You know, they would. If somebody else would fight for them, Americans, Ukrainians, Martians, better, because this is what SAF likes. SAF likes to have wars where other people do the fighting for them. That's what they use the Bedouin for. The problem is their servants have turned against them. So both sides are completely cynical about the peace process. They see it just as a way to kind of manipulate the situation for the and for advantage. Now, what the international community was trying to do was to see if there was space that could be given for humanitarian access for the Sudanese people who are suffering terribly, who are starving, who are being killed, who are seeing the infrastructure of the country destroyed. So that's what the peace, peace is not going to be decided at that thing, at that, in Jeddah or whatever. But at the very least, the hope was that they could give some help to the Sudanese people.
And where is the humanitarian situation heading? Have these generals at any point been willing to at least let in the humanitarian efforts? Because from what I hear, it's a complete disaster and the access is very difficult to impossible.
Well, humanitarian access in Sudan has always been difficult and impossible. Always. And it's always been manipulated by the military on the ground. There's a long history of the army manipulating humanitarian assistance, stealing humanitarian assistance. And the same is true of the Janjaweed. Both of them did it. They did it 20 years ago. They did it, before then. They did it in the war between the North and the South. So the access has always been very difficult. But it's worse now because, of course, it's an active war zone is in many areas. So people have had to flee. Foreign aid workers have had to flee. You have the local ones who are very much under pressure trying to do what they can. But the situation is a disaster. There's all this attention about before on Ukraine, now on Gaza. The largest humanitarian crisis in the world is in Sudan, not in Gaza and not anywhere else. And it's mostly ignored by the world, unfortunately.
Is there anything that can bring attention to this issue? And also, what happens if things progress as they continue? I don't see that either side changing tactics or any of their backers giving up or anything else changing for the time being, unless something radically new comes in, the US suddenly wakes up and so on and so forth. And what happens if Janjaweed does eventually reach Khartoum, force the government to flee?
Well, the government is not in Khartoum anymore because the Janjaweed control most of the government is in Port Sudan. The question is, could the Janjaweed take over all of Sudan? It's a very big country. It was not easy. I think a more likely scenario is a Libya situation where you have a pseudo partition and you have basically one side dominant west of the Nile and the other side dominant east of the Nile. Although the RSF in Khartoum is east of the Nile, it's on the other side of the Nile. So I think, unfortunately, I think the most likely scenario is certainly in the short to midterm is this kind of the division of the country along east-west sides. I think eventually the war will end. This horrible situation will end, just like you had the horrible civil wars in places like Liberia or Sierra Leone or Congo or Somalia. This is like those wars, Unfortunately, those wars went on year after year after year, and this could happen here as well.
Interestingly enough, before the Gaza war broke out, Burhan seemed to be interested in resuming Abraham Accords-like discussions with Israel, where, presumably now all of that is not even on the table anymore or not particularly relevant, but what would be the impact of such a development? Would Israel be legitimizing a very dysfunctional non-government by... Would that agreement be worth the paper it was signed on, basically, even if it happens in theory?
This has always been the problem with the Abraham Accords in Sudan, and that is, with whom is it with? And the fear of this is before the war. The fear was that Israel entering into an agreement would weaken the move towards democracy in Sudan and empower the generals. Well, guess what? The movement for democracy is, people are running for their lives, and the generals are running things. Now, both traditionally, the idea was that Hemeti and the RSF were more pro-Israel, and that the army was less pro-Israel because the army had Islamists. But what happened is, it was Burhan who met Netanyahu in Uganda, not Hemeti. And so you had basically had, at some point, you had Israelis talking to both sides. But right now, I don't see there's anything to gain for Israel, nor anything to gain by either side. I mean, obviously Israel has weapons, but the type of weapon, lack of weapons is not a problem in the war in Sudan right now. Both sides are awash in weapons. The army side has problems; it doesn't have enough soldiers. That's another issue. That's an issue. Israel can't help them with that. No. So the way I see it, the situation will just continue the way it is, and it will remain kind of a dead letter until there's a government in Sudan, whenever that is, and that could be years from now.
Meanwhile, looking at the U.S. policy side of things, the most recent development is that the House Republicans were trying to pressure the Biden administration into a change in policy. And the policy has been that U.S. basically appointed a special envoy for the Horn of Africa, who went around to different places and talked to different factions. But I'm not entirely sure how much impact any of that has had on any of the conflicts. I mean, some people were sanctioned, I guess, but what is the U.S. policy right now, and what is it? What kind of change are the Republicans pushing for, and would that change be helpful?
Look, I mean, having a special envoy is a cheap way to show that you're interested, right? To show that you're going to have people who are just following this issue. There was a special envoy before, focused on the Horn of Africa, which meant both Ethiopia and Sudan. But the bureaucracy, the Africa Bureau in the State Department, pushed out the special envoy. So it was kind of fighting between the Biden State Department Africa Bureau and the Biden State Department Special Envoy Office. The Special Envoy Office lost. The central problem with U.S. policy in Sudan is this, and that is there are no easy fixes that don't require a lot of money or soldiers or something like that. So there's no easy fix. Meanwhile, half the world is on fire. So the disaster in Sudan, the Americans know it's a disaster. The Americans want it to stop. But there's only so much time. There's only so much effort. There's only so much money. There's only so much military pressure. You pressure these allies, for example, one side or the other. But the Americans need those allies for other things. Need them for Gaza. They need them for, Russia, Ukraine war. They need them for oil. They need them on China. They need them against Iran. So the Americans are not going to go to UAE or Saudi Arabia or Egypt and bang the desk and say, you must do this. Because they'll say, okay, we'll do this, but we won't do that. And the Americans care about this and that. So you try to juggle, you try to push them a little bit on Sudan, but you also have to push them on oil prices, Israel, Palestine, whatever, China, Iran, half dozen other issues. So it's just the tyranny of the urgent. The Sudan crisis is a disaster, but there are other disasters, and sometimes some of those are seem simpler, right? They're more binary. In Sudan, you have two very bad sides fighting each other. One is worse, probably. RSF is worse than SAP right now. Tomorrow could be the other way around.
And
So
speaking of Iran that you've mentioned, Iran has been very much active under Bashir's rule. The Al-Qaeda, we all remember the Al-Qaeda rapprochement with Iran that the government facilitated. Where is it now with respect to this situation?
Iran has come back. Sudan broke relations with Iran at the behest of the Saudis
Hmm.
during the Yemen war.
Hmm.
So 2015, I believe, 2015, 2016, I don't
Hmm.
remember exactly, around that time. So Sudan, under Bashir, distanced itself from Iran. Iran is back. Iran supports the army against the RSF.
You can't make this up. Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Turkey, and Iran are all, and the
On the
US
same side,
presumably, are all
are
on
on
the
the
same
same
side.
side. Yes, yes.
Can we see Iran's greater engagement? And if so, can Iran use this crisis, regardless of any, concerns for either party, for some sort of to push some sort of agenda in Africa beyond
Yeah,
this
well,
particular?
Iran has an agenda in Africa, and it's to project power there,
Mhm.
to be able to have like-minded regimes that are helpful to it. You know, just like you have, for example, Venezuela in Latin America and South America. It's very much helpful to Iran. Cuba, helpful to Iran. Iran wants states that are like that, that are very helpful to Iran. You have Algeria is a regime that is pro-Iranian, um, opposed to Morocco, which is pro-Israel. So Iran would like to see, certainly Muslim regimes that are that it can be allied with for a variety of reasons. So Iran has ambitions, for example, in the Red Sea.
Mhm.
Uh, Iran, you may remember, Iran used to smuggle, even though they don't border each other, Iran used to smuggle rockets into Gaza through Sudan.
Mhm. Very much so.
There's a it's a there's a smuggler network, smuggler, criminal, sometimes government, right, where they would smuggle things from Sudan, through Egypt, through Sinai, and into Gaza back in the day. Um, that was some years ago. That was 10 years ago or so. And in fact, Israel attacked Sudan to stop those shipments a couple of times. There were actually airstrikes by Israel in Sudan to prevent these missiles being smuggled into Gaza. So Iran is obviously looking for regimes that are going to be sympathetic to it, that are going to enable it to project power against Israel, against the Americans, and against the West in general.
Could Iran take advantage of the chaos to turn Sudan into a new recruiting ground for additional Africa-based militias and proxies, and also to build some sort of a military base that could give it more access to the waters?
That's the dream. I mean, we're a long way from that. And of course, the Muslims in Sudan are Sunni Muslims, but Iran is also interested in converting
Hmm.
Sunni Muslims to Shia Islam, strange as it is. And, there in Nigeria, there are some, and elsewhere, there are some.
Hmm.
But the dream is that. The
Hmm.
reality is very distant from that. The Iranians, for example, Iranians in Syria, which is a lot closer to Iran, they want to convert Syrian Muslims to Shia Islam. And they've had small successes, but not a massive change. So they would have exactly the same ambitions in Africa, but mostly that's dreaming now, not reality.
Hmm. Well, we've just examined yet another messy piece of an increasingly disastrous geopolitical puzzle with very little influence by Westerners in any number of growing, proliferating conflicts around the world. And there seems to be less and less ability for the West to project power and to put an end to these conflicts.
Yes, I agree.
That's the bottom line, unfortunately. Let's hope that somebody will eventually wake up and see that this can't really continue. But until then, unfortunately, it seems that things will, for the near future, we are stuck with this self-perpetuating cycle of infighting and the sectarian fragmentation.
Yes, unfortunately, I think that the most likely scenario in Sudan is the war will continue until one side or another burns out, until there's just sheer exhaustion sets in, and that's not quite happening yet.
Well, thank you so much for your valuable insights into this predicament, which was a completely dark, black hole of ignorance for most people, and hopefully they'll understand the situation is a little bit more and tend to ignore it a little less after getting some insight into that. And for those watching the program, that this was Ambassador Alberto Fernandez with us to discuss the conflict in Sudan that is, rivals some of the other conflicts, but is ignored a lot more because it is not seen as geopolitically relevant and as impactful on surrounding areas. That could change if the situation continues, as it is located in a very geographically important area and fraught with other conflicts. For those watching the program, we'll be back next week as usual, Tuesday night, 9 p.m., the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. Thank you so much for watching and have a great night.